It was 6:30 in the morning when the pounding on my front door started. Not a polite knock, not even an insistent one. This was the kind of banging that made you think your house was either on fire or being raided by the FBI. Half asleep, I stumbled to the door, still in my pajamas, only to find Karen from the HOA standing there with a clipboard in one hand and a face full of righteous indignation. You know Karen, the one who treats her HOA title like she's been elected mayor of a small dictatorship. Her hair was perfectly coiffed, her lips pursed so tight they could probably cut glass, and she had that gleam in her eye that screamed, "I'm about to ruin your day." "Good morning, Jack," she said, in a tone that suggested it was anything but. "We need to talk about the vehicle. Now, let me explain something." The vehicle she was referring to was my wife Mary's car. A 15-year-old sedan that had seen better days but still got her from point A to point B when needed. Except now it didn't. The car had been parked in front of our house for weeks because Mary, who's disabled, hadn't been able to drive it lately. And yes, maybe it wasn't the prettiest sight on the block, but it wasn't hurting anyone either. At least, not until Karen decided it was her personal mission to have it removed. "It's an eyesore," Karen declared, flipping through her clipboard like she was reading off charges at a trial. "And it's against HOA regulations." "Karen," I said, trying to keep my voice calm despite the fact that I hadn't even had coffee yet. "We're not part of the HOA. We've never joined." She gave me a tight smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Oh, but you live within the boundaries of our community, Jack. That means you're subject to our rules." Now here's where things get interesting. Legally speaking, Karen was full of it. I'd done my homework before buying this house and knew for a fact that we weren't obligated to join the HOA or follow their ridiculous rules about lawn height and mailbox colors. But Karen wasn't about to let a little thing like facts get in her way. "I'm giving you 24 hours to move that car," she said, tapping her pen against her clipboard for emphasis. "If it's still there tomorrow, we'll have it towed." At this point, I could feel my blood pressure rising faster than gas prices in California. "You can't do that," I said firmly. "It's parked on a public street." Karen raised an eyebrow as if daring me to challenge her authority. "Oh, we'll see about that. Now pause here for a second because I need to ask you something. Have you ever dealt with an HOA, Karen? If you've ever had someone try to micromanage your life because they have nothing better to do, then you know exactly how infuriating this situation was. And if you haven't, well, consider yourself lucky. Anyway, back to the story. After Karen strutted off like she'd just won some kind of power trip Olympics, I went inside and told Mary what had happened. She wasn't surprised. Karen had been harassing us ever since we moved in. But she was furious. "She can't tow my car," Mary said, slamming her coffee mug down on the table for emphasis. "That's illegal. She thinks she can do whatever she wants," I replied grimly. And that's when Mary got that look in her eye, the one that meant Karen had just picked the wrong disabled woman to mess with. But before we get into what happened next, and trust me, it gets good, I just want to take a moment to say, if you're enjoying this story so far, and really, how could you not? Go ahead and hit that like button. Subscribe if you haven't already because there's plenty more where this came from. And hey, leave a comment below if you've ever had your own run-in with an HOA nightmare. I'd love to hear about it. Alright, back to Karen and her clipboard of doom. The rest of the day passed uneventfully, too uneventfully if you ask me. It was like the calm before the storm. And sure enough, at exactly 3 p.m., a tow truck rolled up in front of our house like clockwork. I ran outside just as the driver was hooking up Mary's car. "Whoa, what are you doing?" I shouted. "Got an order from the HOA," he replied with a shrug. "But we're not part of the HOA," I protested. The driver just gave me a blank look and pointed at Karen, who was standing across the street with her arms crossed and a smug grin plastered across her face. "Sorry," he said as he climbed back into his truck. "Take it up with them." And just like that, poof, Mary's car was gone. When I turned back toward Karen, she actually had the audacity to wave at me like this was some kind of friendly neighborhood interaction instead of blatant harassment. "You'll thank me later," she called out cheerfully before disappearing into her house. Thank her? Oh no. No. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. Mary spent the next few hours on the phone with everyone from our local police department to a lawyer friend who specialized in HOA disputes. Meanwhile, I started digging through Utah state laws about towing regulations, because apparently this is what my life had come to. And let me tell you something. Once we started piecing everything together, the lack of proper notice before towing, the fact that our street wasn't even private property, it became crystal clear that Karen and her little HOA cronies were way out of line. But here's where things get really interesting. As angry as Mary and I were, and believe me, we were livid, we also couldn't help but laugh at how absurd this whole situation was. Like seriously, who wakes up one day and decides their life goal is to be that person? The kind who spends their free time policing other people's cars? It would have been hilarious if it weren't so infuriating. So yeah, that's how our day went from mildly annoying to full-blown ridiculous in less than 24 hours thanks to one power-hungry HOA president and her vendetta against an old sedan. So there we were, carless, furious, and knee-deep in HOA nonsense. After the tow truck disappeared down the street with Mary's car, I sat on the couch staring at my laptop, determined to figure out exactly how Karen had managed to pull this off. I mean, towing someone's car off a public street? That couldn't be legal. It just couldn't. And if it was, well, then the system was even more broken than I thought. Mary, meanwhile, was pacing back and forth in the living room like a general preparing for battle. She can't get away with this, she kept muttering under her breath. She thinks she's untouchable because she's got that stupid clipboard and her HOA title. But not this time. Not on my watch. Now, let me tell you something about my wife. Mary is the kind of person who doesn't back down from a fight. She's been through a lot in her life, more than most people could handle, and she's come out stronger every time. So when Karen decided to mess with her, she might as well have poked a bear with a stick. The first thing we did was call the police. We figured they'd be able to tell us whether what Karen did was even remotely legal. And you know what? They were surprisingly helpful. The officer we spoke to explained that while HOAs do have some authority over private property within their boundaries, they can't just tow vehicles off public streets without following proper procedures. And by proper procedures, he meant giving written notice, waiting a certain number of days, and filing the necessary paperwork with the city. "Did you get any kind of notice?" he asked. "Nope," I said. "Not a single piece of paper." "Then they're in violation," he replied simply. Hearing that felt like sweet validation. I could practically see Mary's eyes light up as she scribbled down notes on a legal pad like an attorney preparing for court. But here's where things got even better. The officer also mentioned that we could file a formal complaint against the HOA for unlawful towing. Apparently, there are actual laws in place to protect people from this kind of nonsense. Who knew? He even gave us the contact information for the city department that handles these disputes. Armed with this new information, Mary and I spent the next few hours gathering evidence. We pulled up our neighborhood's zoning map to prove that our street wasn't private property. We printed out screenshots of HOA regulations we found online, because yes, Karen had actually uploaded them to the HOA website like some kind of overachieving hall monitor, and highlighted all the parts about towing procedures that she'd blatantly ignored. And then there was the piece de resistance, our home security camera footage. Oh yeah, we had it all on tape. The tow truck pulling up, Karen standing there with her smug little clipboard, and me running outside trying to stop them while Karen waved at me like she was Miss America on a parade float. If this were a courtroom drama, it would have been Exhibit A. By the time we were done, our dining room table looked like something out of an episode of Law and Order. Papers everywhere, sticky notes with angry scribbles stuck to every surface. It was chaos, but it was organized chaos. Now here's where things took an interesting turn. While I was busy printing out copies of everything for our complaint, Mary decided to do some digging into Karen herself. And let me tell you, what she found was chef's kiss perfection. Turns out, Karen wasn't exactly squeaky clean when it came to following HOA rules herself. For starters, her backyard fence was 2 inches taller than the maximum height allowed by HOA guidelines. A minor infraction? Sure, but hilarious given how much she loved enforcing those rules on everyone else. And then there was her mailbox. It wasn't painted in one of the 3 approved colors listed in the HOA handbook. Oh no, Karen had gone rogue and painted hers white instead of beige or gray. But the best part? The absolute cherry on top. Karen's own driveway had an oil stain roughly the size of Texas smack dab in the middle of it. A clear violation of HOA cleanliness standards. Now listen, normally I wouldn't care about stuff like this. Live and let live, right? But if Karen wanted to play dirty and nitpick every little thing about our lives while ignoring her own violations, well then two could play that game. So Mary took photos of everything. Her fence, her mailbox, her driveway, and added them to our growing pile of evidence. By the end of the night, we had enough dirt on Karen to write an entire exposé for the New York Times. It was glorious. The next morning, bright and early, because apparently Mary doesn't believe in sleeping when she's on a mission, we marched down to City Hall and filed our complaint against the HOA. The clerk who helped us couldn't stop shaking her head as she read through all our evidence. "This is ridiculous," she said at one point. "They can't just tow someone's car without notice." "Tell that to Karen," Mary muttered under her breath. We left City Hall feeling pretty good about ourselves. Not just because we'd taken a stand against Karen's tyranny, but because we knew we had the law on our side. And honestly, felt amazing. But here's the thing about dealing with people like Karen. They don't go down without a fight. As much as I wish this story ended with us filing that complaint and living happily ever after, well, let's just say things were about to get even more interesting. For now, though, we were ready for whatever came next, because if there's one thing Mary and I have learned over the years, it's this: never underestimate two determined people armed with facts. And maybe just a little bit of petty revenge energy thrown in for good measure. The next day started off deceptively calm. You know that eerie kind of calm, where you almost feel like the universe is trying to lull you into a false sense of security before it drops a piano on your head. Yeah, that was the vibe. Mary and I were sitting in the kitchen, sipping our coffee, and going over the timeline of events for what felt like the 100th time. We'd filed our complaint, gathered enough evidence to make Karen look like the HOA's most wanted criminal, and even sent an email to the towing company demanding Mary's car be returned immediately. We were prepared, or so we thought. At around noon, there was a knock at the door. Not the aggressive pounding we'd come to associate with Karen, but a polite, almost apologetic knock. I opened it to find a man in his late 40s wearing khakis and a polo shirt with the HOA logo embroidered on it. Let's call him Greg. Greg looked like the kind of guy who'd rather be anywhere else but here. "Hi there," he said, giving me a tight-lipped smile. "I'm Greg from the HOA board. Mind if I come in?" I didn't trust Greg as far as I could throw him, but I figured it couldn't hurt to hear what he had to say. So I let him in and led him to the living room, where Mary was already sitting with her laptop open like she was ready to cross-examine him. "Look," Greg started, rubbing the back of his neck awkwardly. "I just wanted to say, we've been getting some complaints about Karen." Mary raised an eyebrow. "Complaints? You mean we're not the only ones?" Greg sighed heavily, like a man who had seen too much HOA drama for one lifetime. "No, you're definitely not the only ones. Karen's, well, let's just say she takes her role very seriously." "Seriously?" Mary shot back. "She illegally towed my car off a public street. That's not serious, that's psychotic." Greg held up his hands defensively. "I'm not here to defend her actions. In fact, I think what she did was completely out of line. But here's the thing. Karen technically has some authority as part of the HOA board." "Technically?" I interrupted. "What does that even mean?" "It means," Greg said carefully, "that while she overstepped in this case, she's not entirely wrong about enforcing certain rules." Mary narrowed her eyes. "We're not even part of the HOA." Greg winced like he'd just stepped on a Lego barefoot. "Yeah, about that." And that's when he dropped the bombshell. Apparently, there was some obscure clause buried deep in our neighborhood's original development agreement, like page 47 of 50, that stated any property within a certain radius of the HOA boundaries could be subject to their rules if deemed necessary by the board. "Are you kidding me?" I said, throwing my hands up in disbelief. "So we're just automatically part of this nightmare because someone wrote it into a document 20 years ago?" Greg nodded sheepishly. "Pretty much." Mary leaned forward, her eyes practically boring holes into Greg's soul. "Let me get this straight. Karen can tow my car without notice because of some ancient clause no one told us about when we bought this house?" Well, Greg said hesitantly, she still should have given you notice first. Oh, she didn't just skip the notice, Mary snapped. She skipped decency, common sense, and probably half a dozen laws while she was at it. Greg cleared his throat awkwardly and stood up. Look, I just wanted to come by and let you know that we're reviewing your complaint and taking it very seriously. Good, Mary said flatly, and Greg continued quickly before she could cut him off again. We're also going to have a special meeting with Karen and the rest of the board next week to address this situation. Mary crossed her arms and gave him a look that could have frozen lava. You'd better. After Greg left, Mary turned to me with that determined glint in her eye, the one that usually meant someone was about to regret crossing her. We're not waiting until next week, she declared. What do you mean? I asked cautiously. I mean, she said with a wicked grin. We're going to make sure Karen knows exactly who she's messing with. That afternoon, Mary went full-on Sherlock Holmes mode. While I was busy drafting yet another strongly worded email to the towing company, because apparently they thought ignoring us would make us go away, Mary was digging into every piece of public information she could find about Karen and her reign of terror over our neighborhood. And oh boy, did she find some gems. For starters, Karen had been fined by the city 3 years ago for failing to properly maintain her front yard. Something about letting weeds grow taller than 2 feet during a drought season. Then there was the time she tried to get one of our neighbors fined for putting up Christmas lights too early in November. Yes, really? And let's not forget her infamous feud with another neighbor over whether or not wind chimes were considered noise pollution. But here's where it gets really good. Mary discovered that Karen had actually been reprimanded by the HOA board last year for, wait for it, violating parking rules herself. Apparently, she'd been parking her SUV in front of someone else's house for weeks because she didn't want to block her own driveway. The irony was so thick you could cut it with a knife. Armed with this new information, and more than a little petty satisfaction, Mary decided it was time to take things up a notch. She printed out copies of every public record she could find on Karen's past misdeeds and started distributing them anonymously around the neighborhood. Now listen, normally I'm not one for stirring up drama, okay? Maybe just a little. But watching our neighbors' reactions as they read through those papers was priceless. Some were shocked. Others were downright gleeful. And by the end of the day, let's just say Karen wasn't exactly winning any popularity contests. Meanwhile, we finally got a response from the towing company after threatening legal action. They agreed to release Mary's car without charging us any fees, as they should have in the first place. It felt like a small victory in what had become an all-out war against HOA tyranny. By dinner time, Mary and I were feeling pretty good about ourselves. Not just because we'd gotten her car back, but because we knew we'd managed to hit Karen where it hurt most. Her reputation as queen of all things HOA. The day of the HOA meeting arrived, and let me tell you, Mary was ready. I mean ready. She had a binder full of evidence, a PowerPoint presentation queued up on her laptop, and that determined look in her eye that said, I'm about to destroy someone's entire career in amateur neighborhood politics. Meanwhile, I was just trying to keep up. My role in all of this? Moral support and carrying the snacks. Because if there's one thing I've learned about HOA meetings, it's that they're long, boring, and in desperate need of better catering. But this wasn't going to be your average HOA meeting. Oh no, Mary had made sure of that. For starters, she'd invited the local police department's K-9 unit to attend. Yep, you heard that right, the K-9 unit. Now, before you start picturing a pack of German shepherds storming into the room like it's an episode of Cops, let me explain. Mary had reached out to one of the officers we'd spoken to earlier about the towing incident and asked if he'd be willing to come along as a witness. He agreed and brought his partner, a very well-behaved K-9 named Max, for good measure. So there we were, Mary, me, Officer Daniels, and Max the dog, walking into the community center like we were about to film the most dramatic courtroom scene in history. Karen was already there, of course, sitting at the head of the table with her clipboard and her trademark smug expression. She didn't even glance in our direction when we walked in. Probably because she was too busy whispering to Greg and shooting death glares at anyone who dared make eye contact with her. The meeting started off predictably enough. Greg called it to order, read through the agenda, which Karen had clearly written herself, and then opened the floor for public comments. That's when Mary stood up. "Good evening," she began, her voice calm but firm. "My name is Mary Thompson, and I'm here to address the illegal towing of my vehicle by this HOA." You could practically hear a pin drop. Karen shifted uncomfortably in her seat but didn't say anything. "Yet," Mary continued, "as many of you know, my husband Jack and I are not members of this HOA. We've never signed any agreements or paid any dues. And yet, last week, my car was towed from a public street without notice or cause." At this point, Karen finally spoke up. "It was an eyesore," she said dismissively, "and it violated our community standards." Mary didn't miss a beat. Community standards? Are those the same standards that allow you to have an oil-stained driveway and an unapproved mailbox? The room erupted into murmurs as Karen's face turned bright red. Greg tried to restore order by banging his gavel on the table, because apparently HOAs have gavels now. But it was clear that Mary had struck a nerve. "And let's talk about those community standards," Mary continued, pulling out her binder like she was about to present Exhibit A in a murder trial. "According to your own bylaws, which I've printed out for everyone here tonight, any towing must be preceded by written notice delivered at least 72 hours in advance. Did I receive any such notice?" "No." Karen opened her mouth to respond, but Mary held up a hand to stop her. "I'm not finished," she said coolly. She flipped to another page in her binder and held it up for everyone to see. "This is a copy of the city ordinance regarding towing from public streets. It clearly states that only law enforcement or authorized city officials can order such actions, not private citizens or organizations." Officer Daniels nodded in agreement from his seat at the back of the room. Max wagged his tail as if to say, "Yeah, what she said." By now, Karen looked like she wanted to crawl under the table and disappear. But Mary wasn't done yet. "And while we're on the subject of rules," she said with a pointed glance at Karen's clipboard, "I'd like to address some other violations that seem to have gone unnoticed by this board." She proceeded to list every single infraction Karen had committed over the past year. The too-tall fence, the unauthorized mailbox color, the Christmas lights incident, you name it. Each time she mentioned something new, another neighbor gasped or whispered something like, "I knew it," under their breath. By the time Mary finished her presentation, which included slideshows, security camera footage, and even a signed statement from one of our neighbors who'd witnessed Karen giving instructions to the tow truck driver, the room was buzzing with outrage. Greg finally managed to get everyone's attention long enough to call for a vote on whether or not Karen should be removed from her position as HOA president. And let me tell you, watching Karen's face as every single hand went up in favor of her removal was one of the most satisfying moments of my life. But here's where things got really interesting. After Karen stormed out of the room, clipboard in hand, Greg apologized profusely for everything that had happened and promised to reimburse us for any expenses related to the towing incident. He also announced that they'd be revising their bylaws to prevent anything like this from happening again. And as if that weren't enough, Officer Daniels offered us free tickets to an upcoming K-9 demonstration as a thank you for bringing Max along. And yes, we absolutely took him up on it. So there you have it. One illegal tow truck fiasco later, justice was served, and Karen learned what happens when you mess with someone who knows how to fight back. As we left the meeting that night, victorious and slightly giddy, I couldn't help but feel grateful for two things. My incredible wife, who is basically a superhero, and Max, who is basically the best dog ever. Because if there's one thing this whole experience taught me, it's that sometimes revenge really is best served cold, with a side of legal documentation and maybe just a little bit of petty satisfaction thrown in for good measure. After Karen stormed out of the HOA meeting, clutching her clipboard like it was the last shred of her dignity, you'd think the drama would have ended there, right? Wrong. Because if there's one thing I've learned about people like Karen, it's that they don't go down quietly. No, they go down kicking, screaming, and dragging as many people into their mess as possible. And boy, did she deliver. The very next morning, Mary and I were enjoying a rare moment of peace. Coffee in hand, the sun shining through our kitchen window, when my phone buzzed with a notification. It was an email from Greg. Subject line, "Follow up on HOA meeting." Now, I'll admit I hesitated to open it. After everything that had gone down the night before, I wasn't sure I had the emotional bandwidth to deal with whatever fresh nonsense was waiting for us. But curiosity got the better of me. The email started off innocently enough. Dear Jack and Mary, thank you for attending last night's meeting and bringing these important issues to light. Okay, great. So far, so good. But then came the kicker. Unfortunately, Karen has filed a formal appeal with the HOA board, claiming that her removal was unlawful and that your complaint was based on personal bias. Personal bias? Oh, Karen, sweetheart. If by personal bias you mean a desire to not have our lives micromanaged by a clipboard-wielding tyrant, then sure, guilty as charged. I showed the email to Mary, who rolled her eyes so hard I thought they might get stuck in the back of her head. Of course she's appealing, she said with a sigh. She can't just accept that she lost. But here's the thing. Karen's appeal wasn't just some petty attempt to save face, although it was definitely that too. No, she was also demanding a full investigation into what she called our pattern of disruptive behavior. According to her, we were habitual troublemakers who had been undermining the integrity of the community since day one. Now let me tell you something. If there's one thing Mary hates more than injustice, it's being accused of something she didn't do. And Karen had just lit a fire under her. Fine, Mary said, slamming her coffee mug down on the table. You want an investigation? Let's give her one. And just like that, we were back in battle mode. The first thing we did was pull up every single email exchange we'd ever had with Karen or the HOA board. And let me tell you, there were a lot. From her passive-aggressive reminders about lawn maintenance to her unsolicited critiques of our holiday decorations. Apparently, our inflatable snowman was too large for community standards. We had enough material to write an entire book titled Karen, a memoir of pettiness. But we didn't stop there. Oh no. We also reached out to our neighbors, the same ones who had cheered Mary on at the meeting, and asked if they'd be willing to share their own experiences with Karen's reign of terror. The response was overwhelming. Within hours, we had stories pouring in about everything from fines for unauthorized bird feeders to threats of legal action over sidewalk chalk drawings. One neighbor even sent us a photo of a letter Karen had taped to their front door demanding they repaint their house because the color was too bright. The house was beige. Armed with this mountain of evidence, Mary drafted what can only be described as a manifesto. A 15-page document outlining not only Karen's history of abuse but also her blatant disregard for HOA rules when it suited her. She included photos, emails, witness statements, you name it. By the time she was done, it looked like something you'd submit to a congressional hearing. We sent the document to Greg and the rest of the HOA board with a polite but firm note. If Karen wants an investigation, we're happy to cooperate fully. A few days later, we got another email from Greg, this time inviting us to attend a special session where Karen's appeal would be reviewed. The session was scheduled for Saturday morning at 9 a.m., which felt like adding insult to injury because who wants to deal with HOA drama before breakfast? But we agreed to go anyway because at this point, it wasn't just about us anymore. It was about standing up for every single person in our neighborhood who'd ever been victimized by Karen's clipboard crusade. When Saturday rolled around, we showed up at the community center armed with printed copies of Mary's manifesto and enough coffee to keep us awake through what promised to be yet another marathon meeting. Karen was already there when we arrived, sitting at the head of the table like some kind of deposed queen plotting her comeback tour. She didn't even look at us as we walked in. Instead, she busied herself arranging her papers into neat little piles and pretending not to notice when Greg called the meeting to order. What followed can only be described as 2 hours of pure chaos. Karen started off by reading a prepared statement in which she accused us of everything from defamation to conspiracy. Yes, really? She claimed that our complaint was part of a coordinated effort to sabotage her leadership and insisted that she'd only ever acted in the best interests of the community. Mary let her finish, because she's nothing if not polite. But as soon as Karen sat down, she stood up and calmly began dismantling every single one of her arguments. First of all, Mary said, holding up a copy of our neighborhood's original development agreement, Jack and I are not members of this HOA and therefore not subject to its rules. Karen opened her mouth to respond, but Mary cut her off. Second, she continued, flipping through her binder like a seasoned attorney cross-examining a hostile witness. "Even if we were members, which we are not, you violated your own bylaws by towing my car without notice." And then came the piece de resistance. Mary pulled out a stack of letters from our neighbors detailing their own experiences with Karen's overreach and began reading them aloud one by one. By the time she finished, which took nearly 20 minutes, the room was dead silent except for Greg nervously tapping his pen against the table. In the end, it wasn't even close. The board voted unanimously to uphold Karen's removal as president and issued an official apology for everything we'd been put through. They also announced plans to review their bylaws and implement new checks and balances to prevent future abuses of power. As for Karen, she left without saying a word, though I'm pretty sure I saw her muttering something under her breath as she stomped out the door. And just like that, it was over. Well, almost over. Because as satisfying as it was to see justice served, there was still one thing left on our agenda: celebrating with our neighbors, and maybe just a little bit of gloating while we were at it. After Karen stormed out of the special HOA session, defeated and clutching what little was left of her dignity, and, of course, her clipboard, Mary and I walked out of that community center feeling like we had just won the Super Bowl. Except instead of a trophy, we had a unanimous vote, a formal apology, and the knowledge that Karen was no longer in charge of anything except her own driveway, which, let's be honest, was still in violation of HOA rules thanks to that massive oil stain. But as satisfying as it was to see justice served, we weren't quite done yet. You see, there was still the matter of the towing fees. Sure, we'd gotten Mary's car back without having to pay a dime, but the towing company hadn't exactly been cooperative. And let's not forget the emotional damage, because nothing says trauma quite like waking up to find your car being hauled away by a tow truck while your HOA nemesis stands on the curb smirking like she's just won an Oscar for Best Villain. So Mary decided to take things one step further. She filed a small claims case against both the towing company and the HOA for damages. Now, I know what you're thinking. Isn't that overkill? But here's the thing, when you mess with Mary, you don't just get a slap on the wrist. You get the full legal experience, complete with exhibits, witness testimony, and maybe even a pie chart or two for dramatic effect. The court date was set for 3 weeks later, which gave us plenty of time to prepare. And by prepare, I mean Mary spent every waking moment gathering evidence, while I made sure we had enough snacks and coffee to fuel her crusade. We even enlisted the help of Officer Daniels, remember him? To provide an official statement about the towing laws Karen had violated. Max the K-9 didn't contribute much, unless you count moral support, but he did wag his tail enthusiastically whenever Mary mentioned Karen's name. So we took that as a good sign. When the day of the hearing finally arrived, we walked into that courtroom like we were starring in our own legal drama. Mary had her binder, of course. I had my moral support snacks, also important. And Karen, well, Karen didn't show up. Apparently, she'd decided to let Greg handle things on behalf of the HOA, which was probably for the best since her track record with public appearances wasn't exactly stellar. The towing company did send a representative. A guy named Steve who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else but there. He tried to argue that they were just following orders from the HOA when they towed Mary's car, but Mary wasn't having any of it. "Following orders?" she said, raising an eyebrow. "Are you telling me you didn't bother to check whether those orders were legal before towing a disabled woman's vehicle off a public street?" Steve stammered something about standard procedure, but it was clear he didn't have much of a defense. And when Officer Daniels took the stand to explain exactly why their actions were illegal under city law, well, let's just say Steve started sweating like he was auditioning for an infomercial about antiperspirant. As for Greg, bless his heart, he tried his best to defend the HOA's actions without throwing Karen completely under the bus. But it quickly became clear that even he knew they didn't have a leg to stand on. "I'd like to remind everyone," Greg said at one point, "that our intention was never to cause harm or distress." Mary shot him a look that could have melted steel. "Your intention doesn't change the fact that my car was illegally towed," she replied calmly. "And let's not forget who gave those orders in the first place." Greg didn't have much to say after that. In the end, it took less than an hour for the judge to rule in our favor. The HOA was ordered to pay us $2,500 in damages, enough to cover not only the towing fees but also some additional compensation for all the stress and inconvenience they'd caused. The towing company got off with a warning and probably a stern talking to from their legal department. But honestly, we were just glad they wouldn't be working with Karen anymore. As we left the courtroom that day, check in hand and heads held high, I couldn't help but feel a sense of closure. Sure, it had been a long and exhausting battle, but it was worth it knowing that we'd stood up for ourselves and our neighbors against someone who thought she could get away with anything just because she had a clipboard and an inflated sense of authority. And speaking of our neighbors, when word got out about our victory in court, they decided it was time for a celebration. Within days, plans were underway for what can only be described as the anti-Karen block party. A neighborhood-wide event complete with barbecue grills, lawn games, and even a karaoke machine, because nothing says justice like belting out "We Are the CH" amp ions at full volume. Mary and I offered to host it in our backyard since we figured it was only fitting, and because let's be honest, after everything we'd been through, we deserved some good karma points with our neighbors. The party turned out better than we could have imagined. People brought food, drinks, and even homemade signs with slogans like "No More Clipboard Tyranny" and "Karen-Free Zone." Someone set up a projector screen so we could play highlights from Mary's PowerPoint presentation at the HOA meeting. Yes, really? And Max made an appearance as our honorary guest of honor, complete with his own little party hat. By the end of the night, as everyone gathered around to toast Mary for her bravery and determination, and maybe just a little bit of pettiness, I realized something important. This wasn't just about us anymore. It was about standing up against injustice, no matter how small or seemingly insignificant, and proving that even ordinary people can make a difference when they refuse to back down. So here's to Mary, the real MVP of this whole saga, and here's to every single person out there who's ever had to deal with their own version of Karen. Because if there's one thing this experience has taught me, it's that sometimes revenge isn't just sweet, it's downright necessary. After the epic anti-Karen block party, you'd think life in our neighborhood would finally settle down. Right? Wrong. Because even though Karen had been dethroned, her clipboard confiscated, okay, not literally, but one can dream, and her reign of terror officially ended, Mary wasn't quite ready to let the dust settle. Oh no, my wife, the queen of petty revenge and justice, had one final trick up her sleeve. And honestly, it was brilliant. A few days after the party, Mary sat me down at the kitchen table with a mischievous grin on her face. "Jack," she said, "we need to send Karen a message." I raised an eyebrow. Didn't the court ruling and the block party already do that? Mary shook her head. Not enough. She needs to know that this neighborhood isn't hers anymore, and that she's officially been banned from meddling in anyone's business ever again. Now, I'll admit I was skeptical at first. What more could we possibly do? But then Mary pulled out a piece of paper and slid it across the table. It was a mock-up of a sign. A big, bright, obnoxiously cheerful sign that read, "Welcome to our Karen-free community. No clipboards allowed." I burst out laughing. "You're serious?" "Dead serious," Mary replied, her grin widening. "We're putting this up right at the entrance to the neighborhood." And that's exactly what we did. The next morning, armed with a hammer, nails, and way too much enthusiasm for two people who had never built anything in their lives, we installed the sign at the neighborhood entrance. It was glorious. Bright yellow with bold black letters that practically screamed petty revenge. We even added a little cartoon illustration of a clipboard with a red circle and slashed through it for good measure. The reaction from our neighbors was immediate and overwhelmingly positive. People honked their car horns as they drove past it. Kids stopped on their bikes to take pictures. Even Greg, bless his heart, sent us an email saying he thought it was a creative way to boost community morale. As for Karen, well, let's just say she wasn't thrilled. About a week later, I spotted her standing in front of the sign with her arms crossed and her face twisted into what can only be described as pure rage. She paced back and forth for a few minutes like she was trying to figure out how to remove it without drawing attention to herself. But eventually she gave up and stomped off in defeat. And honestly, that moment alone made all the effort worth it. But here's where things got even better. The sign quickly became a local legend. People started sharing photos of it on social media with captions like, "Finally free from HOA tyranny," and "Living my best Karen-free life." Someone even created a hashtag no more clipboards, which started trending in our town for a solid week. Mary, of course, loved every second of it. She spent hours scrolling through the posts and laughing at all the comments from people who'd had their own run-ins with HOA Karens over the years. And as much as I hate to admit it, I kind of loved it too. But wait, there's more. Inspired by our success with the sign, Mary decided to take things one step further. She created an online group for our neighborhood called the Anti-Karen Alliance, where people could share their stories, vent about HOA drama, and brainstorm ways to make our community more fun and less clipboard-y. Within days, dozens of neighbors joined, and before long, we were hosting monthly meetups to discuss everything from lawn care tips to organizing charity drives. It was like we'd started a revolution against petty rules and unnecessary drama, and honestly, felt amazing. As for Karen, well, she kept a low profile after all this went down. She stopped attending HOA meetings altogether, probably because she knew she'd be outnumbered. And aside from the occasional death glare when she passed us on the street, she didn't bother us again. Victory had never tasted so sweet. Now here's where I get sentimental for a second. Looking back on everything that happened, from the towing fiasco to the courtroom showdown, I can't help but feel proud of how far we've come as a community. Sure, it started with Mary and me standing up for ourselves against one very determined clipboard enthusiast, but it turned into something so much bigger than us. We proved that you don't have to put up with nonsense just because someone has a title or thinks they're in charge. We showed that ordinary people can make a difference when they refuse to back down, and maybe have a little fun along the way. And honestly, that's what this whole experience has been about. Standing up for what's right while keeping your sense of humor intact, even when you're dealing with someone like Karen. So if you've ever had your own HOA nightmare, or if you've ever felt like you were stuck in an unfair situation, let this story be your reminder that you're not alone. And if you ever need inspiration for how to handle it, well, just remember, there's always room for a little petty revenge. Alright folks, that's it for this wild ride of a story. If you enjoyed hearing about how we took on Karen and won with style, don't forget to hit that like button. Share this video with your friends, especially if they've got their own HOA horror stories, and leave a comment below telling me what you think about our Karen-free community sign. And hey, if you haven't already subscribed to this channel, now's your chance. We've got plenty more hilarious stories coming your way about life's little battles and big victories, because let's face it, sometimes reality is stranger and funnier than fiction. Thanks for watching, and remember, no clipboards allowed.